Hey Dungebags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is time for my review of the 6th studio album from Ferry Corsten. This one is called Blueprint. Ferry Corsten is a famed Dutch trance DJ and producer, really being one of the true pioneers of the genre. This guy's been making hits since even before I was born. Although I wasn't personally introduced to Ferry Corsten until 2012, when Artie remixed his song Punk, which was then featured on the last Swedish House Mafia album Until Now. I personally have a ton of respect for this guy, and although I haven't been super into his studio albums in the past, in fact I thought they were kind of cheesy in large part. With myself getting more and more into trance music over the last few years, I really look back at Ferry Corsten as one of the people who really define the sound of the genre, and of course I love him for that. And like I said, traditionally I haven't absolutely loved Ferry Corsten's attempts at going at studio albums. I always think they feel a little like forced and a little cheesy compilations rather than like really solid studio albums. But this album really caught me off guard in particular. I actually came across Blueprint randomly on the album's release day while searching, of course, through iTunes new album releases on that day. As usual, when I come across a new album that I hadn't heard anything about prior to that point, my first instinct was to go into this thing and listen to the previews, and I noticed something very strange, that this, like all the previews, basically contained dialogue and nothing else. Regardless, I was very intrigued by this, as this was far, far away from anything Corsten had done in the past over his nearly 30-year-long career so far, and I couldn't wait to sink my teeth into everything that Blueprint was. Blueprint is a concept album in really every sense of the word, with the album directly telling the story of love between a teenage boy named Lucas and an android named V. I'll be honest right off the bat, I didn't think this album was absolutely fantastic, although I do think it really is one of the standout records so far from the year, just being that EDM doesn't really see people, and especially in trance music, doesn't really see people kind of trying to do something like this before. A lot of records really in electronic dance music end up just feeling like compilations, and this album obviously is going for something different. I really like that Ferry Corsten's really trying to change things up after almost 30 years of doing EDM. To that point, I feel like a number of EDM blogs might have overrated this album just a little bit, just because in the electronic music scene we really aren't spoon-fed albums like this all the time like you would in hip-hop music. For example, there have been a lot of great concept albums in that genre over the last couple years. In electronic music, we don't really get that very often, so I think a lot of people kind of got a little too excited about this album, because I don't think, like I said, I don't think this album is super fantastic, but it is a step in a different direction, which I can absolutely respect. One thing that's great about this album that generally fits my style as a listener is that you really can't just pick out singles from this thing. There have been so many EDM albums over the last couple years that really have one or two big singles on this, and really no one else really wants to take it and listen through the whole thing. This album kind of forces you into that vein. You can't listen to just a single track on this album because there's dialogue at the beginning and end of each of these tracks. With that, I think Blueprint showcases Ferry Corsten having an entire newfound respect for the album. These songs are masterfully tied together through these bits of narration and dialogue, the latter of the two being handled by the primary vocalists of this album, Haleen and Eric Lumiere. Haleen is actually one of my personal favorite vocalists in the whole EDM world right now, so obviously I had high expectations for her appearances on this thing, and I've liked Eric Lumiere in the past as well, so I can say I was excited to hear him on a few tracks on this thing too. And although I'd love to praise Ferry Corsten for mostly matching up the album's vocalists with its respective characters, I honestly think having Haleen and Lumiere be the voice actors on this thing might have been a little bit of a mistake. Honestly, I think their voice acting hurts this album more than it helps it. And I mean, that's mostly understandable. I get it. Haleen and Eric Lumiere are not actors by any means. You can't expect their vocal performances to be absolutely astounding in that department, but honestly, I would have preferred to have different voice actors that would have absolutely killed their roles than just to have the vocalist match up with the actors, if that makes any sense. Because in my opinion, the thing that this album has the most points going for it is its storyline. Don't get me wrong, there's some great productions on this album, but wipe the dialogue clean off of it and there's really nothing holding this thing together. I remember listening to this thing for the first time and being largely bored by a chunk of the middle section, just because the productions get super drab around that point, and the storyline isn't moving a ton either, with V kind of going off off about, oh, I don't know if I want to stay here on your planet, or if I want to go back to my home planet. Everything's kind of confusing. V seems to be going kind of back and forth. So in my opinion, that's when the storyline is weakest and the production is weakest as well. You're kind of just stuck in this awkward spot where you get these really long songs, like A World Beyond, that's almost 10 minutes long and is in my opinion, don't take any offense to this, but it's one of the most boring productions on the album, as well as A Piece of You and Wherever You Are. Those songs didn't excite me a ton either, and I didn't think their vocal performances by HALIENE were anything near up to her standards that she's done in the last couple years. So at least in my experience, you kind of just sit there kind of wading through these really long, not super atmospheric trance songs that don't have a ton of substance to them, just kind of waiting for the next bit of dialogue, going through another song, waiting for dialogue. And this thing does get really intense, at least toward the beginning of the album and the end of this thing, but there's a lot of filler on this album, really. I don't think this thing needed to be an hour and a half long, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. I think easily a few tracks could have been cut, and the story could have moved a little bit faster. That's really my only huge complaints with the album, beside, like I said, with the voice acting. Other than that, this thing moves along perfectly nicely, especially during the beginning of the album and the end of the album. In fact, toward the end of the thing, we get the song Another Sunrise, which is finally this grand duet between Eric and HALIENE. The story writing was a little bit cheesy here and there, although I do think that's excusable for the most part, being that this is a love story and that generally kind of happens. And obviously there's a reason why I haven't talked about the story a ton in this review already, and that's because I don't want to spoil this thing for you guys, just in case you do want to listen to it, because I absolutely would suggest this album for at least one listen. I think this is an essential, especially for trance music coming out this year. But in my personal interpretation of the story, I think Lucas is kind of meant to be this outcasted teenager. His family and friends he doesn't feel super close to, and then he's kind of welcomed into the rave community, which I think is generally supposed to be represented by V, kind of falls in love with that. And then generally I think this idea of the government and society kind of thinking this drum is a weapon is kind of how the media portrays the electronic dance music scene, being as violent or drug-filled or anything like that. As TV, radio, whatever kind of tends to portray the dance music community as, and really Ferry Corsten's kind of trying to fight that with this album, saying no, it's a very peaceful community, everyone loves each other and everything like that, even though that's not entirely true. That's kind of generally the vibe I got from this album while listening to this thing. I drew a lot of parallels between Lucas and myself, and kind of V and her planet, and what the dance music community is at least supposed to look like. And it takes a few listens of this thing, in my opinion, to fully get what Ferry Corsten's trying to lay down, although maybe you'll have a different interpretation of this album than I did. But either way, I would definitely suggest it for at least a listen or two. And yeah, this album does have its dull points to it, but in my opinion, I think those are mostly outweighed by some pretty grand productions and a semi-compelling story. I would definitely suggest this thing to any lover of trance music, and really any fan of electronic music that really likes heavily conceptual albums. I enjoyed this thing a lot, and I think you will too. For Ferry Corsten's Blueprint, I am feeling a light 7 out of 10. As always, I have the Spotify link down in the description if you guys want to go check this one out for yourselves, and like I said, I would highly suggest it. And if you have listened to this one already, let me know what you think about it down in the comment section below. As always, I'm Landon Remixes. I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and I'll catch you later. Peace.